What makes a person truly dangerous? Most of us instinctively picture the obvious. The violent criminal lurking in an alley. The tyrant who rules with an iron fist. The manipulator who bends crowds to his will. These figures fit neatly into our categories of danger. They look the part, they act the part, and society recognizes them as threats. But Carl Jung suggested something far more unsettling, that the true mark of danger is rarely visible on the surface. The most dangerous person is not always the one who embraces their darkness, but the one who denies it completely, the one who looks in the mirror and sees only light, purity, and righteousness, while secretly dragging a shadow behind them that grows heavier with every step they take. Picture this: a city at dusk, its skyline fractured by ruins and glass, the people who walk its streets where polite smiles, speak in rehearsed voices, and carry on their rituals of normalcy, yet beneath their civility there is a silence too deep, an unease too sharp. It is as if everyone knows, without daring to admit it, that something monstrous hides beneath the surface of their collective face. Jung believed that this hidden side of human nature, the shadow, wasn't an occasional flaw or a rare defect, but a universal truth. Every person carries within them impulses that society has deemed unacceptable. Hatred, envy, rage, lust, cruelty, greed. We bury these impulses deep, convinced that by pretending they don't exist, we can transcend them. But Jung warned that repression does not destroy the shadow, it only strengthens it, and when that darkness finally seeps out, it often does so in ways that are destructive, uncontrolled, and catastrophic. The paradox is chilling. A person who openly admits their flaws, who acknowledges their capacity for cruelty or selfishness, can be dangerous. Yes, but they are also more predictable. They wear their shadow on their sleeve. The real danger lies in those who swear they are incapable of evil, who present themselves as flawless, morally pure, untouchable, because it is precisely this refusal to acknowledge their shadow that makes them slaves to it. Imagine a man who insists he has no anger. He plays the role of the saint, patient and smiling, but one day that suppressed fury explodes with the force of years of denial, leaving devastation in its wake. Or consider the preacher who loudly condemns sin, all the while hiding the same sins in the dark corners of his own life. When the mask cracks, when the truth finally emerges, the betrayal is more corrosive than the act itself. Jung wrote, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. The more a person insists on their purity, the more ruthless their shadow becomes when it finds expression. This is why Jung considered the denial of one's shadow the most dangerous sign in a person. It is not what they admit that should frighten us, but what they deny is. You hear these words, the question grows uncomfortably close. What shadows live inside you? What thoughts, desires, or impulses do you deny so completely that you've convinced yourself they don't even exist? Perhaps you see yourself as kind, honest, righteous, and maybe you are, but Jung would whisper a warning. Beneath that mask, in the dark recesses of your being, something else waits, and the more you ignore it, the more power it holds over you. This is where our story begins, not with the criminals society points to, not with the tyrants who wear their hunger for power on their sleeve, but with the far more ordinary face, the neighbor, the leader, the friend who claims to be incapable of darkness. Because if Jung was right, the greatest danger in a person is not the presence of evil, it is the refusal to recognize it. Understand why Jung considered the denial of the shadow the most dangerous sign in a person. We must first understand the man himself, the strange, conflicted, and visionary figure who saw further into the abyss of the human soul than almost anyone of his time. Carl Gustav Jung was not just a psychologist. He was a man haunted by visions, by dreams so vivid they felt more like revelations than illusions. Born in Switzerland in 1875. He grew up in a household marked by contradictions. His father was a pastor, a man bound by the rigid structures of Christian doctrine, but his own mind rebelled against certainty. Even as a boy, he was captivated by the hidden forces of the psyche, sensing that beneath the polite surface of human life lay something vast, chaotic, and frighteningly real. Jung's early career was shaped by his relationship with Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis. Freud believed that much of human behavior was rooted in repressed sexuality and unconscious drives for a time. Jung was Freud's protege, the heir apparent to his empire of ideas, but there was a problem. Jung could not accept the narrowness of Freud's vision. To Jung, the human psyche was not just a tangle of sexual desires and family dramas, it was a sprawling universe filled with myths, archetypes, and symbols that connected us to something far older than ourselves. Break between Freud and Jung was not just intellectual, it was spiritual. Freud insisted that psychology must remain rooted in materialism, science, and rational analysis. Jung, however, dared to venture into territory. Freud feared dreams, mysticism, religion, alchemy, and myth. Where Freud saw neuroses, Jung saw mythological battles. Where Freud saw repression, Jung saw archetypes, universal patterns etched into the human mind since the dawn of civilization. It was in this exploration that Jung uncovered one of his most haunting ideas. The shadow, Jung wrote, is the part of ourselves we refuse to see. It is the dark mirror of the ego, containing everything we wish to deny: hatred, violence, selfishness, greed, but also hidden strengths and instincts we bury out of fear or shame. Unlike the persona, which is the mask we wear to please the world, the shadow is everything we push into the basement of our soul, convincing ourselves it doesn't exist, but it exists, it grows, and it waits. Jung did not come to this idea lightly during his midlife crisis. After breaking from Freud, he plunged into what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. For years, he recorded his dreams, visions, and dialogues with figures that appeared in his imagination. These writings, later compiled in his infamous Red Book, reveal a man wrestling with madness or, perhaps, with truths too vast for ordinary minds. He described encounters with mythic characters, terrifying images of blood and fire, and prophetic visions of Europe descending into chaos. These were not mere hallucinations. Many of them eerily foreshadowed the rise of fascism and the outbreak of World War I. From these visions, Jung drew a conclusion: the shadow is not just personal, it is collective. What we repress individually festers in the basement of our own psyche. But what a society represses festers in the basement of history. Entire nations, Jung believed, could fall victim to their collective shadow, and when that happens, the results are catastrophic. But before we leap to society, we must return to the individual, because Jung's warning begins not with nations, but with you. He argued that the most dangerous sign in a person is their insistence that they have no shadow. Why? Because the more you deny your shadow, the more it controls you. Unconsciously think of the person who prides themselves on being endlessly kind, who insists they never feel anger. The person's shadow is boiling with rage, waiting for the moment it explodes. Think of the person who believes themselves morally superior, incapable of corruption. That person's shadow is already plotting behind the mask, growing more ruthless with every denial. Jung's genius was to see that repression creates possession. Whatever we refuse to acknowledge within ourselves will eventually control us from the shadows, and when it does, we often project it outward. We see the evil we deny in ourselves reflected in others. We call them dangerous, corrupt, immoral, ever realizing that what we condemn in them is often what we cannot face in ourselves. This is why Jung considered the shadow so critical to him. Psychology was not merely about curing neuroses or analyzing dreams, it was about survival. A person who cannot face their shadow becomes a danger to themselves and everyone around them. They are unpredictable, driven by forces they don't understand, capable of justifying almost anything because they believe their motives are pure. For Jung, the path forward was not to eliminate the shadow, because that is impossible, but to integrate it, to look into the darkness without flinching, to admit our capacity for cruelty, hatred, and destruction. Only then, he believed, could we truly be whole. Jung once said, One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. It is a disturbing thought because it suggests that wisdom does not come from denying our demons, but from confronting them face to face. This is the world into which Jung invites us. A world where the human psyche is not a battlefield between good and evil, but a labyrinth where the monsters we refuse to see become the ones that control us. And if we fail to confront them, we don't just risk our own destruction, we risk becoming the very monsters we fear. Birth of the Shadow was not just a psychological theory, it was Jung's warning, and it is here, in the denial of the shadow, that he saw the most dangerous sign in a person. Carl Jung's insights into the human psyche were not abstract theories locked away in dusty books. They were warnings, urgent, almost prophetic, and at the core of these warnings lies a simple but terrifying truth. The most dangerous sign in a person is the complete refusal to acknowledge their own shadow. It sounds deceptively simple. How could denial, something so quiet, so invisible, be more dangerous than open hatred, open cruelty, or open violence? But Jung understood something that most of us instinctively avoid. A person who admits their flaws, however dark, can wrestle with them consciously, but the one who insists they have no flaws, no darkness, no shadows, such a person is already enslaved by what they refuse to see, to understand why. Imagine a mask on the surface. It is polished, radiant, flawless. It presents to the world an image of goodness, purity, strength, but behind that mask, in the silence no one sees, something begins to rot. Every denied impulse, every repressed desire, every hidden cruelty gathers there. Unacknowledged, the person wearing the mask convinces themselves they are whole, but in truth, they are being hollowed out from within. And when the mask finally cracks, as it always does, the explosion of darkness is not small, it is catastrophic. Jung described this with one of his most famous insights: the brighter the light, the darker the shadow, the greater the insistence on perfection, the greater the violence of what is denied. And this is why denial is the most dangerous sign in a person. It creates a rift between the mask and the reality, between who they claim to be and who they truly are. Consider the preacher who rails against sin, presenting himself as the embodiment of purity, only to be later exposed for the very vices he condemned. Consider the politician who promises honesty, transparency, and moral superiority, while secretly indulging in corruption and betrayal. Their downfall is not just personal hypocrisy, it is the eruption of a shadow denied for too long. And the damage is magnified because their followers, too, believed the masks. But this danger is not confined to leaders, it exists in every one of us. Take, for example, the man who insists he is incapable of violence. He believes himself calm, peaceful, beyond anger, and perhaps, for years, he suppresses his rage. He smiles when he wants to scream, he retreats when he longs to fight. But repression does not erase the impulse, sharpens it, until one day his composure fractures, and the violence he has denied for decades bursts forth in a single uncontrollable act. People are left stunned. He was such a kind man. No one could have predicted this, but Jung would have predicted it, because the denial itself was the warning. Signor, imagine the woman who insists she is incapable of envy. She claims to be endlessly supportive, always happy for the success of others, but inside, resentment builds each achievement of her peers, cuts into her like glass. Outwardly, she smiles, applauds, congratulates. Inwardly, she withers, and when her mask finally breaks, her envy emerges in passive aggression, betrayal, or destructive acts. She herself cannot explain. The refusal to admit these emotions makes them far more dangerous than if they had been acknowledged from the start. A person who says, "Yes, I feel envy sometimes, I feel anger sometimes, I feel hatred sometimes," can learn to manage those impulses. But a person who insists, "I never feel that I am above that," is already trapped in a lie. The lie has a way of consuming them. Jung went further, warning that this denial often leads to projection. We cast onto others the very darkness we cannot admit in ourselves. The man who denies his own cruelty sees cruelty everywhere else. The woman who denies her own lust condemns others for their immorality. The society that denies its own violence frames another nation as the barbarian. The savage, the threat projection, allows us to keep the mask intact, but it also blinds us, because while we point the finger outward, we lose sight of the fact that the monster we fear is often within us. This is what makes denial so lethal. The person who embraces their shadow may still do harm, but at least they know what they are dealing with. The person who denies their shadow walks blindly, convinced of their own purity, while their hidden impulses guide their steps. They can rationalize almost anything, because they genuinely believe they are incapable of evil, and that is precisely what makes them capable of the worst kinds of evil. History is littered with examples: the leaders who convinced themselves they were liberators while plunging nations into tyranny, the zealots who believed they were defending truth while burning others at the stake, the revolutionaries who swore they were creating justice, only to build new systems of oppression in each case. The danger was not in the acknowledgement of darkness, but in the denial of it. The conviction of purity was the mask. The shadow, denied and ignored, was the true ruler. But perhaps the most disturbing part of Jung's warning is not about them, it is about us. Because when we hear these stories, when we think of the preacher, the politician, the zealot, it is easy to distance ourselves, to think, I am not like that, I would never fall so far. But that thought itself, that reflexive denials, the very thing Jung warned against, the shadow, is not something rare, belonging only to villains, tyrants, or criminals. It belongs to you. To deny it is to give it power. To acknowledge it is to begin to master it. Jung's words force us to face an uncomfortable mirror. The more convinced you are of your own innocence, the more dangerous your shadow has already become. The question then becomes unavoidable. What parts of yourself have you denied? What impulses have you buried so deeply that you no longer recognize them? And if they were to surface, how would they shape your actions, your relationships, your world? Jung's answer was clear and unsettling. The most dangerous person is not the one who sins openly, but the one who believes themselves incapable of sin. The most dangerous leader is not the one who admits flaws, but the one who insists on purity. And the most dangerous shadow is not the one you confront, but the one you refuse to see. Carl Jung's warning about the shadow was never confined to the individual. He saw its presence woven into the very fabric of history, because just as a single person can deny their inner darkness until it explodes, entire societies can repress their collective shadow until it bursts forth in violence, fanaticism, and destruction. And when this happens, the cost is measured not in broken relationships or fractured identities, but in blood, war, and the collapse of civilizations. Jung's lived through 2 world wars, and he saw firsthand how the shadow of entire nations could become unleashed. He watched as millions of ordinary people, teachers, farmers, workers, priests, swept into movements that promised light, purity, and salvation, yet unleashed unimaginable darkness. For Jung, these were not simply political or economic phenomena, they were eruptions of the collective unconscious. Shadows denied for too long, and then projected outward in catastrophic ways. The most striking example, of course, is Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler rose to power not by presenting himself as a monster, but as a savior. He promised renewal, pride, order, and purity. He spoke of destiny, greatness, and the cleansing of corruption on the surface. It was a vision of light, but Jung would argue that this very insistence on purity was the mask of a deep shadow, the hatred, resentment, and fear that Germany had repressed after its defeat in World War I, the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, the economic collapse, the hunger, the resentment. These were not confronted directly. Instead, they were buried beneath a narrative of victory and revenge. And when Hitler projected that darkness onto Jews, Romani people, political dissidents, and countless others, the German people embraced the projection. They could believe that their suffering was not their own shadow, but the fault of an external enemy. This is the danger Jung described. Once the shadow is projected outward, people no longer see themselves as perpetrators of evil, they see themselves as defenders of purity, justice, righteousness. This illusion allows them to commit atrocities without guilt, because they believe they are fighting against the evil other. The concentration camps, the gas chambers, the mass graves. These horrors did not emerge from a people who saw themselves as villains. They emerged from a people convinced they were heroes, purging the world of darkness. But Germany was not alone. Consider the Stalinist purges of the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Joseph Stalin orchestrated one of the most brutal campaigns of political repression in history. Millions were imprisoned, tortured, or executed in the name of defending socialism from enemies of the state. Stalin projected the shadow of his own paranoia, ruthlessness, and hunger for power onto traitors and saboteurs. Entire communities were shattered as neighbors accused neighbors, not out of truth, but out of fear. Here again, the denial of the shadow produced its own nightmare. To admit weakness, failure, or corruption within the system would have been to acknowledge the shadow instead. The Soviet state insisted on its purity, its righteousness, its inevitability, and so, the shadow had to be placed elsewhere in fabricated conspiracies. Imagined enemies and innocent victims. The same story repeats across time during the Inquisition. The Catholic Church believed it was defending divine truth, rooting out heresy for the salvation of souls, but in truth, it was projecting its own fear, corruption, and insecurity onto others, burning thousands at the stake in the name of God. During the colonial era, European empires convinced themselves they were bringing civilization, enlightenment, and progress to foreign lands, but beneath the mask of moral superiority lay greed, exploitation, and violence. The shadow of conquest was projected onto colonized peoples, labeled as savages and barbarians, so that their subjugation could be justified. Each of these moments in history reveals the same terrifying pattern. The more a society insists on its purity, the darker and more violent its shadow becomes, and the more that shadow is denied, the more ruthlessly it must be projected outward onto others. Jung warned that collective denial is more dangerous than individual denial because it multiplies the shadow's power. A single person's repression may damage their own life and those around them, but a nation's repression, magnified by millions of people who share the same illusion, can devastate the world. This is why Jung described the rise of mass movements with such dread. He saw them not merely as political phenomena, but as psychological contagions, outbreaks of the shadow on a collective scale. And if we are honest, this pattern has not vanished. We see it in modern nationalism, in culture wars, in the bitter polarization of politics. Every group insists on its righteousness, its victimhood, its purity, while projecting the shadow onto the opposition. The other side is always the corrupt one, the immoral one, the dangerous one. Each side clings to the illusion of purity, blind to the darkness within its own ranks. The cycle repeats because we refuse to learn the lesson Jung tried to teach. Denying the shadow does not eliminate it, it only strengthens it. The danger is that history does not just remember these eruptions of the shadow as abstract tragedies. They are lived realities for millions who suffer under them. Every child lost in war, every innocent condemned as an enemy, every community destroyed in the name of purity. That is the cost of collective denial. Jung's warning was not philosophical speculation, it was an attempt to wake us up before history repeated itself again and again. Yet, even as we reflect on these lessons, denial persists. Nations rewrite their histories to preserve their self-image. Institutions bury their scandals to maintain the illusion of morality. Individuals participate in systems of exploitation, while convincing themselves they are on the side of justice. The shadow is still here, alive and growing, waiting for the next eruption. Once wrote that the shadow, when denied, does not vanish, grows darker and more destructive, feeding on the lies we tell ourselves. If this is true, then every society that insists on its Innocence is already walking a dangerous path. The most frightening truth is not that evil exists. It is that evil is so often committed by those who believe they are incapable of it. This is why history must be remembered, not just as a record of facts, but as a psychological warning. Every time we hear of atrocities committed in the name of righteousness, we are hearing the voice of the shadow. Every time we see cruelty justified as purity, we are seeing denial at work. And every time we tell ourselves we would never do that, we are stepping closer to the very same danger Jung warned about. Because the shadow is not history, it is not Germany, or Russia, or Spain, or Europe. It is us, it is humanity. And the question is not whether we have a shadow, is whether we will acknowledge it before it devours us. Again, we like to believe that the world we live in today is fundamentally different from the one Carl Jung observed a century ago. Technology, democracy, global awareness all seem like shields against the shadows of human psychology. And yet, if we dare to look closer, we find that the most dangerous sign Jung warned about has not disappeared, it has only changed its mask. Narcissism is no longer confined to individuals, it has become a cultural phenomenon, woven into the very fabric of modern life. Social media, for example, has given birth to a theater where the ego can perform endlessly. Every post, every photo, every update an opportunity to craft an image, to be adored, envied, or validated. But what begins as harmless self-expression often spirals into obsession. The self becomes a brand, and the individual begins to lose touch with anything real. Beneath the polished images lies insecurity, fragility, and hunger for approval that never ends. And this hunger is not random. Entire industries profit from it. Platforms engineer algorithms designed to feed the ego's appetite while deepening its dependency. The more a person is consumed by their image, the easier they are to control. The illusion of freedom becomes a prison of invisible bars, built not by force, but by psychological manipulation. Jung would have recognized this instantly. For him, the unintegrated shadow was always vulnerable to outside forces. What we refuse to acknowledge within ourselves will eventually be weaponized against us. The corporate world, too, thrives on these dynamics. Many modern leaders, politicians, CEOs, celebrities demonstrate precisely the traits Jung considered the most dangerous: grandiosity without introspection, confidence without humility, charm without substance. They attract followers not because they embody truth, but because they embody the fantasies people want to project onto them. Jung called this inflation of the ego, a state where a person believes themselves to be larger than life, almost divine. And history teaches us that when such individuals rise to power, destruction often follows. Consider how propaganda has evolved in the modern era. In Jung's time, propaganda was already powerful, but today it operates with surgical precision through data tracking, behavioral analysis, and personalized feeds. Modern systems know what we fear, what we desire, and what we secretly envy. They exploit these vulnerabilities to shape behavior and opinions, often without us even realizing it. And here is the danger: when individuals are detached from self-awareness, when they deny their own shadows, they become perfect vessels for manipulation. They think they are acting freely, but in truth, they are following scripts written for them. We can see this most vividly in the rise of extremist movements and cult-like followings. They thrive on the projection of unacknowledged anger, fear, and desire. The leader becomes the embodiment of what the followers cannot admit about themselves. To Jung, this was not just politics, it was psychology on a massive scale. And what is more chilling is how seamlessly it integrates with modern systems of power, political polarization, celebrity culture, consumerism. They are all, in some way, arenas where unacknowledged shadows play out. But the problem is not just out there, in politicians or corporations, it is in each of us. We live in a culture that celebrates success at any cost, rewards appearances over substance, and equates worth with external validation. And so, the temptation to craft false selves is everywhere. We project strength while hiding weakness, we chase visibility while ignoring meaning, we silence doubts and insecurities. pushing them into the shadow until, inevitably, they re-emerge in destructive ways. Depression, anxiety, and burnout are not merely personal struggles. They are symptoms of a society that refuses to face itself. Jung's warning is painfully relevant here. He wrote that when people do not integrate their shadow, they become possessed by it. This possession might look like arrogance, cruelty, or obsession with control on a larger scale. It looks like societies driven by greed, fear, and blind conformity. A society where individuals are not self-aware is easily swayed, easily divided, and easily ruled. Answer. The most dangerous sign is not just the narcissist at the top, nor the manipulative corporation, nor the corrupt politician. It is the collective willingness to deny the darkness within ourselves, to outsource responsibility for our inner lives, and to live as though appearances were reality, because once we do that, the door is wide open for those who know how to exploit our blindness. Modern relevance, then, is not simply about seeing narcissism in others, it is about seeing how the very structure of our world nurtures it, rewards it, and weaponizes it. This is why Jung's psychology feels almost prophetic. He knew that unless individuals confront their shadows, societies would repeat the same cycles, falling prey to illusions, repeating tragedies, and mistaking ego for truth. And this brings us to the most unsettling realization. The danger is not that narcissism exists. The danger is that it thrives precisely because we feed it, admire it, and secretly envy it in a world where the ego is currency. Narcissism is not an accident, it is the system itself. When Carl Jung wrote about the shadow, he spoke mostly in terms of the individual, the buried instincts, the unspoken desires, the unacknowledged fears that hide in the private corners of a person's psyche. But what happens when these shadows don't remain confined to the individual? What happens when millions of people, each repressing their own hidden darkness, begin to merge into a single collective identity? Jung believed that the shadow was not just personal, but collective, that within the unconscious of a society, a culture, even a nation, there exists a shared reservoir of fear, resentment, aggression, and desire for power. This collective shadow often lies dormant until the right conditions awaken it. History has shown us time and time again what happens when this hidden beast rises. Entire nations can become possessed by a kind of mass psychosis, where the darkest qualities of human nature are not only expressed, but celebrated suddenly. What was once unspeakable becomes common. What was once taboo becomes normalized. Violence, scapegoating, and hatred stop being individual sins, and instead become public duties. Take the 20th century as an example, the century of extremes, from Nazi Germany to Stalinist Russia, from the Cultural Revolution in China to genocides in Rwanda and the Balkans. We see not merely political failures, but psychological ones. These were not random eruptions of cruelty, but manifestations of the collective shadow, released when fear, resentment, and the hunger for meaning were channeled into destructive ideologies. Rise of Hitler was not just about one man's charisma or one nation's economic struggles. It was about the German collective shadow humiliation after World War I. Economic despair, cultural resentment, all bubbling beneath the surface, waiting for someone to name it, give it a direction, and unleash it. When Hitler spoke, he didn't just appeal to reason, he appealed to something deeper, something darker. He gave voice to the shadow that millions had been too ashamed to admit, even to themselves. And once that shadow was externalized, it was no longer hidden, it was acted upon. It became a reality. Not just an idea. Ordinary people who once might have been gentle neighbors could now become willing participants in unspeakable atrocities. Because they were no longer acting as individuals, they were swallowed by the collective psyche, consumed by the shadow of their society. This is the terrifying truth about the collective shadow. It grants a kind of moral permission when everyone around you shares the same darkness. It no longer feels dark when cruelty becomes a collective norm. It no longer feels like cruelty, it feels like duty. But the collective shadow doesn't always reveal itself in such grand historical tragedies. Sometimes it seeps more quietly, shaping Culture, in ways we barely notice, it shows up in the polarization of politics. Where entire groups are demonized and dehumanized, it reveals itself in mass consumerism. Where the shadow of greed and envy drives people to worship status, wealth, and vanity, it emerges in online mob mentality, where thousands unite not in the pursuit of truth, but in the collective joy of destroying someone else's reputation. These may seem less severe than genocides or dictatorships, but they stem from the same principle. When individuals refuse to confront their own shadows, they project them onto others, and when enough people do this together, a society is formed, not on but on collective denial. The shadow isn't eliminated, it's weaponized. Jung once warned that the greatest danger to humanity was not the bomb, not technology, not even nature itself, but the psyche of man, especially when unconscious, the collective. Shadow is the perfect example of this. It does not require an external enemy to awaken it, only requires a crisis, economic collapse, cultural humiliation, or even a global pandemic. When people feel powerless, afraid, and stripped of meaning, they become fertile ground for the shadow to emerge. So the question becomes, can societies confront their shadows the same way individuals can? Can nations become self-aware, admit their darkness, and integrate it rather than be consumed by it? The answer is complex. Some cultures attempt this through truth commissions, public reckonings with past atrocities, or open dialogues about injustice. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission after apartheid was one such attempt. Germany's deep cultural self-examination after World War II was another. But even then, shadows do not disappear, they lurk, waiting for new generations to either face them or repeat them. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of Jung's idea of the collective shadow. No society is immune. Every culture, no matter how advanced, carries within it seeds of resentment, fear, and aggression. The question is not whether the shadow exists. It always does, but whether we are willing to see it before it consumes us. Because the moment we believe it could never happen here is the very moment the shadow tightens its grip.